Richard Harrington reached for the linen napkin without taking a sip of the water Naomi had just poured. His fingers moved with deliberate precision, as though every gesture had been rehearsed over decades of commanding boardrooms where hesitation was considered weakness. Around him, conversation slowly resumed, but the dining room never truly recovered its rhythm. The air still felt tight, stretched thin by the uncomfortable exchange everyone had witnessed. Naomi excused herself with a courteous nod. "Your server will be back shortly with today's specials, sir." She walked away at the same steady pace she always maintained, not too fast to appear flustered, not too slow to seem indifferent. Her polished black shoes clicked softly against the hardwood floor before disappearing through the swinging kitchen doors. The noise changed instantly. Outside, the restaurant sounded elegant. Inside, it sounded alive. Steam hissed from industrial stoves. Plates clattered onto stainless steel counters. Chefs barked table numbers over the roar of exhaust fans while cooks moved in practice choreography around glowing burners. The scent of butter, rosemary, roasted garlic, and fresh herbs hung heavily in the warm air. Naomi set the empty water bottle into a recycling bin and exhaled quietly. "Everything okay?" asked Elena, another waitress balancing 3 dessert plates on one arm. Naomi offered the same gentle smile she seemed to carry everywhere. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I've handled worse." Elena frowned. "That's Richard Harrington out there." Naomi shrugged lightly. "Tonight he's just another guest." Before Elena could answer, the floor manager stepped into the service corridor. "Naomi." "Yes." "He specifically requested that you continue serving his table." A few employees exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody considered that good news. The manager lowered his voice. "Just keep things smooth. I always do." He hesitated before nodding and walking away. One of the line cooks muttered under his breath, "Guy treats people like they're disposable." Naomi simply picked up another tray. She never joined conversations like that. Years earlier, her grandmother had taught her something she never forgot. Never let someone else's bitterness become your own. As she adjusted the folded linen on Richard's table setting, her thoughts drifted somewhere far from Manhattan, to a small apartment in Harlem, to the faded blue curtains that no longer matched the walls, to the quiet woman waiting there. Margaret Brooks had once been a literature teacher who could recite Shakespeare from memory without opening a book. She used to laugh loudly while cooking Sunday dinners, filling every room with warmth before anyone had even tasted the food. Now she sometimes forgot Naomi's name. Some mornings she believed her husband was still alive. Other days she stared through the apartment window for hours, waiting for students who had graduated decades earlier. Alzheimer's didn't steal memories all at once. It borrowed tiny pieces every day until the person you loved became a stranger wearing a familiar face. Naomi worked double shifts because professional care was impossible to afford. Every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. Every smile she gave customers helped pay for another week of medication. She never mentioned that to anyone. Pity never paid the rent. Back in the dining room, Richard was reviewing emails while absent-mindedly scrolling through financial reports on his tablet. His assistants remained standing several feet behind him, speaking only when spoken to. One of them leaned closer. "Sir, tomorrow's merger meeting has been moved to 9. Richard nodded without looking up. "Fine." The Zurich investors also confirmed attendance. "Good." The assistant hesitated. "And your daughter called earlier." Richard finally stopped scrolling. "What did she want?" "She didn't say." His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Schedule something next week." "Sir." "She mentioned it's important." "I said next week." The assistant quietly stepped back. Not another word was spoken. Across the room, Naomi noticed none of it. She was helping an elderly couple celebrate their 52nd wedding anniversary. She knelt slightly beside their table so the gentleman with hearing aids could understand the evening's specials without embarrassment. The old woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you for speaking slowly." "My pleasure." She recommended a softer cut of steak because she noticed the gentleman struggled to chew. She brought extra lemon slices without being asked because she remembered the woman requesting them during a visit nearly 6 months earlier. Tiny details. Small kindnesses. Most guests never realized they had been remembered. The little girl sitting 2 tables away watched Naomi with quiet fascination. Unlike the adults, children rarely judged people by uniforms. They noticed voices, eyes, gentleness. As Naomi walked back toward Richard's table carrying his perfectly prepared entree, the restaurant lights reflected across the polished tray like liquid gold. She didn't know the evening was about to change. Not because of another insult, but because one unexpected moment would force everyone in the restaurant, including the billionaire himself, to discover what true service actually meant. Richard Harrington barely glanced up when Naomi placed the porcelain plate in front of him. The 16-ounce dry-aged ribeye rested on a bed of roasted fingerling potatoes, the herb butter slowly melting into a glossy ribbon across the perfectly seared surface. Beside it sat grilled asparagus arranged with quiet precision, every detail exactly as the restaurant's executive chef intended. "Medium rare," Naomi said politely. "Just as you requested." Richard inspected the plate without touching it. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he picked up his steak knife, pressed lightly into the center of the meat, and watched the warm pink juices gather along the cut. His expression remained unreadable. "I asked for medium rare." "Yes, sir. This is closer to medium." Naomi looked at the steak. The temperature appeared exactly right. "I'm sorry if it isn't to your preference. I'd be happy to have the kitchen prepare another one." "You'd be happy?" His voice carried just enough to draw attention from neighboring tables. "I seriously doubt that." Several diners looked over again. The manager, already nervous from the earlier confrontation, immediately started walking toward the table. Richard leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "You know what's wrong with places like this?" Naomi remained silent. "They've forgotten that customers are the reason they exist." The manager arrived with an anxious smile. "Mr. Harrington, is there a problem?" "There is now." Richard gestured toward Naomi without looking at her. "I've received slow service." He counted on his fingers. "My water was delayed. My steak isn't right. And your waitress seems more interested in giving philosophical speeches than doing her job." The manager's smile faded. "I'm terribly sorry, sir. I don't want apologies." Richard's eyes finally settled on Naomi. "I want competence." A hush settled over the dining room once again. Naomi felt dozens of strangers watching her, waiting to see whether she would defend herself. She didn't. Years of serving difficult customers had taught her something simple. Not every accusation deserved a battle. Sometimes dignity sounded quieter than pride. "If you'd allow me," she said gently, "I'll have the chef prepare a fresh entree immediately." Richard gave a dismissive wave. "You should have gotten it right the first time." The manager turned toward Naomi. "Go ahead and replace it." "Yes, sir." She carefully lifted the untouched plate onto her tray. As she turned, Richard added one more sentence. "And tell the kitchen not to waste another expensive cut of meat." The words followed her across the restaurant like cold rain. Inside the kitchen, Chef Marco looked up the moment he saw the untouched steak. "What happened?" "He'd like another one." Marco frowned as he checked the temperature himself. "This is a perfect medium rare." "I know." He sighed deeply. "Did he complain about you again?" Naomi simply nodded. The chef shook his head before placing another steak onto the grill. "Some people come here looking for dinner." He flipped the meat over glowing flames. "Others come looking for someone beneath them." Naomi offered a small smile but said nothing. While the replacement cooked, she quietly refilled coffee for another table, delivered fresh bread to a young couple celebrating their engagement, and helped an elderly gentleman fold his walker safely beside his chair. She moved through the dining room with the same grace she had shown since the beginning of her shift. No rushed movements. No bitterness. Only quiet professionalism. Near the windows, the little girl continued watching her. She couldn't have been older than 8. Dark curls framed her curious face as she whispered something to her grandfather. The elderly man smiled warmly and nodded before squeezing her hand. Naomi smiled back as she passed. Children always smiled without calculation. That made their kindness feel different. Real. When the replacement steak was finally ready, Chef Marco inspected every detail himself. "This one's perfect." "It was perfect the first time," another cook muttered. Marco ignored the comment. He handed Naomi the plate. Good luck. She balanced the tray and returned to table 12. Richard was reading market reports again, hardly acknowledging her arrival. Your replacement, sir. She gently exchanged the plates. This one has been personally inspected by our executive chef. Richard cut into the steak. Exactly the same warm pink center appeared. He chewed slowly. Silence. The manager stood several feet away, barely breathing. Finally, Richard placed his knife on the table. This one is acceptable. A collective breath seemed to leave the room. The manager forced a relieved smile. Wonderful. But Richard wiped the corner of his mouth with his napkin. Your waitress still lacks something. The manager looked confused. Sir. She smiles too much. Naomi blinked once. Richard folded his hands on the table. People in service should remember one thing. He spoke slowly enough for nearly every nearby guest to hear. No customer wants to feel like the help has opinions. The words hung in the air. No one spoke. Not the manager. Not the diners. Not even the pianist. Across the restaurant, the little girl lowered her fork and looked from Richard to Naomi. Her small face filled not with fear, but with quiet confusion. She didn't understand business. She didn't understand wealth. But even a child could recognize the difference between being served and being respected. The silence lingered long after Richard Harrington's words had settled over the restaurant. No customer wants to feel like the help has opinions. Nobody challenged him. A businessman near the window lowered his eyes to his wineglass. A young couple quietly resumed cutting their steaks, pretending they hadn't heard a thing. The pianist's fingers drifted back onto the ivory keys, but even the melody sounded hesitant now, as if the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. Naomi simply inclined her head. I understand, sir. There was no sarcasm. No bitterness. Just quiet professionalism. She turned to leave. One more thing. Richard's voice stopped her halfway to the kitchen. She turned back. Yes, sir. He glanced toward the small breadcrumb resting beside his plate. My table. Naomi looked down. A single crumb no larger than a fingernail rested near the edge of the white linen. It should have been cleaned already. I'm sorry. She reached into the pocket of her apron and unfolded a fresh linen cloth. Carefully, she brushed the tiny crumb into her palm. Richard watched every movement. So that's what passes for attention to detail these days. The comment earned an uncomfortable chuckle from one of his assistants. Naomi folded the cloth again. Is there anything else I can do for you this evening? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her shoulder toward the dining room. Every employee seemed busy. Every guest appeared content. Everything looked exactly as it should. Yet somehow he still wasn't satisfied. His gaze returned to Naomi. Polish my shoes. The words landed like a glass shattering against marble. For a moment nobody moved. Even the manager froze. Surely they had heard him incorrectly. Richard leaned back in his leather chair. My shoes picked up dust outside. He lifted one polished Italian loafer slightly off the floor. I expect better standards. The manager stepped forward, panic flashing across his face. Mr. Harrington, we don't actually provide. Richard raised one finger without looking at him. I'm speaking to my waitress. Another silence spread through hawthorn and ash. Near the entrance, a server stopped carrying a tray. A bartender paused with a cocktail shaker still in his hand. The executive chef peered through the kitchen window after noticing the strange stillness in the dining room. Naomi looked at the expensive leather shoe. Then she looked back at Richard. For just a heartbeat, something flickered across her face. Not anger. Not humiliation. Sadness. The kind that came from realizing someone had mistaken dignity for weakness. She knelt. Gasps rippled softly through nearby tables. The manager closed his eyes. Elena, standing behind the service station, whispered under her breath. No. Naomi rested one knee lightly against the hardwood floor. She unfolded the same clean linen cloth. Instead of touching Richard's shoe, however, she gently wiped a tiny splash of steak sauce that had dripped onto the edge of the table beside his plate. Then she stood again. The cloth remained spotless. So your table stays clean, sir. Richard frowned. My shoes. Naomi met his eyes. Her voice remained soft enough that no one could accuse her of disrespect. I'm responsible for serving your meal. A pause. And for making sure every guest feels welcome. Another pause. But I was never hired to polish another person's dignity away. No one spoke. The sentence wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. It drifted through the room with the quiet certainty of truth. Richard's jaw tightened. You refuse. I choose to perform the job I promised to do. The manager looked as though his heart might stop. Richard slowly reached for his phone. What's your manager's full name? The manager swallowed. Daniel Foster, sir. Richard tapped the screen. I know the owner. Daniel's face turned pale. I invest in hospitality groups across the East Coast. His thumb continued moving calmly over the display. One phone call. Tap. And employees disappear. Tap. It's remarkable how quickly standards improve. Naomi said nothing. Fear would have been understandable. Instead, she stood with both hands folded neatly in front of her apron. Steady. Composed. Across the dining room, the little girl who had been quietly observing everything tugged gently on her grandfather's sleeve. Grandpa. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Why is he so angry? The elderly man looked toward Richard, then toward Naomi. He sighed softly. Sometimes, he murmured, people who have everything still haven't learned the most important thing. What thing? He squeezed her small hand. How to see another human being. The little girl nodded slowly. Her innocent eyes returned to Naomi. Unlike everyone else in the restaurant, she wasn't watching a billionaire. She was watching the waitress. Because even at 8 years old, she could tell who the stronger person really was. And before another 5 minutes had passed, fate was quietly preparing to test everyone in the room, not by their wealth, their titles, or their power, but by what they chose to do when another human life suddenly depended on them. Richard Harrington never looked away from Naomi. His phone remained in his hand. One call. That was all it would take. He had ended partnerships with a single sentence, removed executives with a signature, and closed restaurants by pulling investments no one else even knew he controlled. To him, influence wasn't something to brag about. It was simply another tool. Daniel Foster stood rigid beside the table, every muscle in his body tense. Mr. Harrington, he began carefully, I'm sure this has been a misunderstanding. Richard didn't even acknowledge him. I'm giving you one opportunity. His eyes stayed fixed on Naomi. Apologize. The restaurant became impossibly still. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the wine refrigerator behind the bar, the soft crackle of a candle burning on the neighboring table, the distant siren of an ambulance somewhere beyond the restaurant's tall windows. Everything else disappeared. She had apologized for delayed drinks. She had apologized for a steak that wasn't actually overcooked. She had apologized simply because kindness often costs less than pride. But this was different. An apology demanded for keeping her dignity was no apology at all. Daniel looked desperately between them. Naomi. He wasn't ordering her. He was pleading. She understood why. One angry billionaire could threaten dozens of jobs, dozens of families, dozens of lives. Naomi slowly folded her hands in front of her apron. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no anger, only honesty. I'm sorry your evening hasn't been what you hoped it would be, sir. Richard's expression remained cold. But, she met his eyes without hesitation. But I can't apologize for treating myself with the same respect I offer every guest who walks through these doors. Another silence. Longer this time. Richard let out a slow breath through his nose. So that's your answer? Yes, sir. You'd rather lose your job. Naomi glanced briefly around the restaurant. She saw Elena standing near the service station, silently praying the confrontation would end. She saw Chef Marco watching from the kitchen pass. She saw Daniel looking as though the weight of the entire building rested on his shoulders. Then she looked back at Richard. I'd rather keep my character. The sentence was almost whispered. Yet somehow it reached every corner of the room. Richard's fingers tightened around his phone. Before he could respond, another voice interrupted. Grandpa. It was the little girl. She tugged gently on the sleeve of the elderly man beside her. Can I tell the waitress thank you now? The grandfather smiled. Of course. The little girl climbed carefully down from her chair, clutching a folded paper napkin in one small hand. She walked across the dining room without the slightest awareness that every adult had turned to watch her. Naomi immediately knelt to meet her at eye level. "Hello there." The little girl smiled shyly. "I drew you something." She handed Naomi the folded napkin. Inside was a simple crayon drawing. A smiling waitress holding a tray. Beside her stood a little girl wearing a yellow dress. Above them, written in uneven handwriting, were 4 words. "Thank you for smiling." Naomi's eyes softened. "It's beautiful. I like your smile." The child spoke with complete sincerity. "It makes people feel safe." For the first time all evening, Naomi's own smile reached her eyes. "That may be the nicest gift I've received in a long time." The little girl wrapped her arms around Naomi's shoulders in a quick hug before skipping happily back toward her table. The dining room remained silent. Several guests looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Because children had a way of exposing truths adults often buried beneath pride. Richard watched the exchange without expression. But something almost imperceptible shifted behind his eyes. Only for an instant. Then it was gone. He picked up his wine glass. "I suppose sentiment has become part of the menu." No one laughed. Not his assistants. Not the neighboring diners. Not even Daniel. Richard noticed. The absence of agreement irritated him more than disagreement ever could. He reached for his knife again. Across the room, the little girl had barely settled back into her chair when her grandfather suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. His fork slipped from his fingers. It struck the porcelain plate with a sharp metallic clang. His shoulders jerked once. Then his right hand flew to his throat. At first, only his granddaughter noticed. "Grandpa!" He tried to answer. No sound came out. His face changed color almost immediately. The smile vanished. His eyes widened in panic. The chair scraped violently across the hardwood floor as he pushed himself halfway to his feet before collapsing back again. The little girl screamed, "Grandpa!" Plates stopped moving. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Someone shouted for help. Another guest stood so abruptly his chair toppled backward onto the floor. Daniel took one stunned step forward. Richard Harrington rose from his seat instinctively, staring at the elderly man only a few yards away. For the first time that evening, the billionaire looked completely unsure of what to do. And before anyone else in the restaurant could move, Naomi Brooks was already running. Naomi reached the elderly man before anyone else even understood what was happening. "Sir." No response. His eyes were wide with terror. Both hands clawed desperately at his throat. The color had already begun draining from his face, replaced by a frightening shade of blue around his lips. The little girl stood frozen beside him, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "Grandpa!" Her voice cracked through the restaurant like breaking glass. Naomi dropped to her knees. "Daniel!" The manager snapped. Out of his shock. "Call 911. Tell them we have a choking victim." Daniel fumbled for his phone so quickly that it slipped from his trembling hands before crashing onto the hardwood floor. I got it." Several guests rushed to their feet. Others instinctively backed away, creating an uneven circle around the table. Someone whispered prayers. Another person began recording with a phone before quietly lowering it again, realizing this wasn't entertainment. This was someone's life. Naomi gently placed one hand on the elderly man's shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" "Nothing." She looked directly into his eyes. "Can you cough?" He tried. No sound came. Only panic. Complete airway obstruction. She knew the signs immediately. Her voice remained remarkably calm. "Everyone, please give him space." The authority in her tone surprised even herself. People obeyed almost instantly. Fear often searched for confidence. And Naomi sounded like someone who knew exactly what to do. Richard Harrington stood only a few feet away. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions. He had spoken before world leaders. He had remained calm during market crashes that wiped fortunes away overnight. Yet now, faced with one dying man, his feet refused to move. He watched Naomi instead. She carefully helped the elderly gentleman stand. "I'm going to help you." The man couldn't answer. His body was already weakening. Naomi positioned herself behind him. One fist, just above the navel, the other hand wrapped firmly over it. She inhaled once, then delivered a sharp upward thrust. Nothing. The man gasped silently. Another thrust. Still nothing. The little girl cried harder. Please help him. Naomi never stopped speaking. Stay with me. Another thrust. Her arms strained with the effort. The restaurant had become utterly silent except for labored breathing and frightened sobs. Richard found himself gripping the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. One of his assistants whispered, "Should we?" Richard didn't answer. His eyes never left Naomi. Fourth thrust. The man's body jerked violently. Still nothing. Sweat gathered along Naomi's forehead. She adjusted her stance. Years had passed since she had practiced emergency procedures, but muscle memory had survived where confidence sometimes faded. Her grandmother's hospital room flashed briefly across her mind. The endless doctor appointments. The nights she spent reading medical books after long shifts because she hated feeling helpless. She pushed the memory away. Focus. One more. She tightened her grip and drove upward with everything she had. The elderly man's chest convulsed. A chunk of steak shot onto the white tablecloth. He collapsed forward, coughing violently. Air. At first only a ragged gasp. Then another. Then a desperate stream of coughing that echoed through the entire dining room. The sound had never been more beautiful. For 2 long seconds no one reacted. It was as though everyone needed confirmation that what they had just witnessed was real. Then the room erupted. Someone shouted, "He's breathing!" A woman covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Several guests burst into spontaneous applause before stopping themselves, realizing this wasn't a performance. The little girl threw herself into her grandfather's arms. "Grandpa!" The old man wrapped one trembling arm around her while struggling to catch his breath. "I'm okay." His voice was weak, barely audible, but alive. Naomi knelt beside him again. "Don't try to stand yet." She checked his breathing. Color slowly returned to his cheeks. His pulse steadied beneath her fingertips. The distant wail of approaching sirens drifted through the streets outside. Only now did Naomi allow herself one slow breath. Her hands trembled. Just slightly. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off. "You saved him." The words came quietly. Naomi looked up. Richard Harrington stood directly in front of her. Gone was the irritation that had hardened his face all evening. Gone was the cold certainty. For the first time since walking into the restaurant, the billionaire looked uncertain, almost humbled. He stared at the elderly man breathing beside his granddaughter, then back at Naomi. "You knew exactly what to do." Naomi slowly rose to her feet. "I recognized the signs." "You have medical training?" She hesitated. "A long time ago." Before Richard could ask another question, the little girl suddenly turned toward Naomi. Without thinking, she ran forward and wrapped both arms tightly around the waitress's waist. "You saved my grandpa." Naomi gently rested one hand on the child's back. "I'm glad I got here in time." The girl looked up through tear-filled eyes. "My grandpa said people should learn how to see another human being." Naomi remembered. He had said those words only minutes earlier. Across the room, Richard heard them too. This time, they didn't sound like a conversation between a grandfather and his granddaughter. They sounded like a mirror. And for the first time that evening, he wasn't entirely comfortable with the reflection staring back at him. The first ambulance siren echoed through the streets just as the restaurant doors burst open. 2 paramedics hurried inside, their boots striking the polished floor in quick succession. Medical bags swung against their sides as they moved through the crowd that instinctively parted for them. "Where's the patient?" "Right here," Naomi answered calmly. The lead paramedic knelt beside the elderly man while his partner clipped a pulse oximeter onto one trembling finger. "What happened?" "Complete airway obstruction," Naomi replied. He was unable to cough or speak. "I performed abdominal thrusts. The obstruction was expelled about 30 seconds before you arrived." The paramedic glanced up. "You medical?" "A little." He nodded once before returning to his assessment. "Sir, can you take a deep breath for me?" The old man inhaled carefully, painfully, but he inhaled. His granddaughter refused to let go of his hand. "It's okay, sweetheart," one of the paramedics said gently. "Your grandpa's doing just fine." The little girl nodded through tears. Naomi quietly stepped backward, allowing the professionals to take over. Her hands suddenly felt heavy. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency was fading, leaving behind only exhaustion. She leaned lightly against a nearby pillar. No one noticed. Everyone was watching the grandfather. Everyone except Richard. His eyes never left Naomi. He replayed the last 5 minutes over and over. Inside his mind, while everyone else had frozen, she had moved. While others shouted, she had listened. While he, a man accustomed to solving impossible business crises, had stood motionless. The waitress he had spent the evening belittling had simply saved a man's life. One of his assistants quietly approached. "Sir." Richard didn't answer. "I think we should probably leave. The press may hear about." "Not now." The words came sharper than intended. The assistant immediately stepped back. Across the dining room, Daniel Foster approached Naomi cautiously. "Naomi." She looked up. "You all right?" She smiled faintly. "I'm okay." "No." Daniel shook his head. "I mean, are you really okay?" She looked toward the paramedics. "I will be once they tell me he's completely stable." Daniel stared at her for a moment. Then something inside him gave way. "I should have defended you." Naomi blinked. "When he humiliated you." Daniel looked down at the floor. "I kept thinking about the restaurant. My staff. The investors. My job." His voice lowered. "And I forgot about you." Naomi placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You were afraid." "I was. We all get afraid." Daniel swallowed hard. "But you weren't." A quiet smile crossed Naomi's face. "I was terrified." "You didn't look terrified." "That's because he needed someone calm more than I needed to feel brave." Daniel had no reply. He simply nodded. Those words stayed with him. Needed someone calm. Not someone important. Not someone powerful. Someone calm. Meanwhile, one of the paramedics walked toward Naomi carrying a small clipboard. "You the one who performed the Heimlich?" "Yes." He extended his hand. "You probably saved his life." Naomi shook it modestly. "I'm just glad it worked." He smiled. "It worked because you knew what you were doing." His curiosity lingered. "Mind if I ask where you trained?" For the first time all evening, Naomi hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the restaurant windows where the city lights shimmered against the dark glass. "I used to be an emergency room nurse." The words were spoken almost like a confession. Daniel stared. "What?" Naomi gave a small laugh. "A long time ago. You were an ER nurse." She nodded. "I worked at St. Catherine's Hospital." "For how long?" "Almost 7 years." Daniel looked genuinely stunned. Then, "Why are you here?" Before Naomi could answer, another voice joined the conversation. "I'd like to know that too." Richard Harrington. He stood only a few feet away now, without his usual commanding posture, without the cold certainty that had followed him into the restaurant. His suit still looked immaculate, but somehow, the man inside it didn't. Naomi turned politely. "The paramedics have everything under control now, sir." Richard ignored the change of subject. "You were an emergency nurse." "Yes." "And now you're serving tables." "Yes." "Why?" Silence settled between them. Naomi looked toward the elderly grandfather laughing weakly as his granddaughter wiped tears from his face. Only after seeing that smile did she answer. "My mother became sick." Richard waited. "Alzheimer's." One word. Nothing more. But it seemed to drain every remaining sound from the room around them. "I couldn't keep working 12-hour hospital shifts." "So you quit." "I chose my family." Richard absorbed the sentence. He had spent decades believing success demanded sacrifice. Long hours. Missed birthdays. Broken promises. Postponed conversations. Everything could wait until next quarter. Until next year. Until after one more deal. Standing before him was a woman who had walked away from a respected medical career. Not because she failed. Because someone she loved needed her. His thoughts drifted, unexpectedly, To the voicemail his assistant had mentioned earlier. His daughter. She had called. He had postponed her. Again. For reasons that suddenly felt much smaller than they had an hour ago. Naomi noticed the distant look in his eyes but said nothing. She had learned long ago that the deepest lessons were rarely taught through arguments. They arrived quietly, wrapped inside another person's example. And for the first time that evening, Richard Harrington found himself wondering whether the woman he had dismissed as just a waitress had accomplished something no board member, no consultant, and no business rival had ever managed to do. She had made him question the man he had become. The ambulance doors closed with a hollow metallic thud before disappearing into the Manhattan traffic, their flashing lights painting brief streaks of red and blue across the restaurant's tall front windows. Inside Hawthorne and Ash, the tension that had gripped every table slowly began to dissolve, replaced by quiet conversations spoken in softer voices than before. No one seemed eager to return to business as usual. The old gentleman had survived. That fact alone had changed the atmosphere. Guests who had spent the evening discussing investments, vacations, and stock prices now found themselves looking at their loved ones a little longer than before. Life had interrupted luxury, and life had won. Naomi quietly gathered the untouched dishes left behind during the emergency. She moved through the dining room exactly as she had all evening, carefully, gracefully, almost invisibly. If someone had entered the restaurant at that moment without knowing what had happened, they might never have guessed that the woman carrying dirty plates had saved a man's life less than 10 minutes earlier. She preferred it that way. Recognition had never been the reason she helped people. As she reached the service station, Chef Marco stepped out from the kitchen. Without saying a word, he handed her a glass of water. She accepted it with both hands. "Thank you. You need to sit." "I'm all right. You've been saying that all night." A faint smile appeared on her face. "I guess I have." Marco folded his arms. "You always forget one patient." Naomi looked at him curiously. "Who's that?" He nodded toward her. "You." She laughed quietly, the sound carrying more fatigue than amusement. "I'll survive. You always make sure everyone else does." Before she could answer, Daniel approached carrying a neatly folded navy blazer. "You left this in the office last week." Naomi looked confused. "My sweater. I know you'll say you're not cold." He smiled gently. "So I'm not asking." She slipped the sweater over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of fresh detergent and lavender. For the first time since the emergency, the trembling in her hands finally began to settle. Across the dining room, Richard remained standing beside his table. His untouched steak had gone cold. His assistants waited several steps behind him, uncertain whether they should speak. Finally, one cleared his throat. "Sir, your meeting with the Singapore investor starts in 45 minutes. Richard looked toward the empty chair where the elderly man had been sitting only moments earlier. 45 minutes. Another meeting. Another negotiation. Another evening spent convincing strangers that time was money. He reached into his jacket and removed his phone. The missed call notification was still there. Emily Harrington. 3 missed calls. 1 voicemail. He stared at the screen much longer than necessary. "When was the last time she called?" he asked quietly. His assistant checked the schedule. "Twice last week." Richard nodded slowly. "And before that?" "The week before." He closed the phone without listening to the message. A strange heaviness settled in his chest. He suddenly remembered something Emily had said nearly a year ago. "Dad, every time I call, your assistant answers before you do." At the time he had laughed. Now, it didn't seem funny anymore. His gaze drifted across the restaurant until it found Naomi. She was helping one of the bussers collect broken glass that had fallen during the commotion. No cameras. No applause. No speeches. Just quiet work. He realized something uncomfortable. She had never once looked around to see who had witnessed her saving that man's life. She didn't need an audience. She simply saw someone in need. And acted. Richard had spent decades surrounding himself with people who constantly reminded him how important he was. Yet the most remarkable person he had met in years wore a simple black apron and spent her evening cleaning tables after preventing a tragedy. Daniel approached him cautiously. "Mr. Harrington." Richard looked up. "I owe you an apology," Daniel began. Richard frowned. "For what?" "I should have handled things differently earlier." Richard remained silent. Daniel continued. "I was afraid of upsetting an important customer." He glanced toward Naomi. "And I almost forgot to stand beside an important employee." Richard followed his gaze. "Important employee. Interesting choice of words. You've had her long?" Richard asked. "Almost 4 years." "Has she ever caused problems?" Daniel actually laughed. "Naomi." He shook his head. "She's the person everyone asks for when things go wrong. The new servers learn from her. The regular guests request her section. The kitchen trusts her. When staff members have family emergencies." Daniel smiled softly. "She's always the first to trade shifts." Richard listened without interrupting. Daniel wasn't describing a waitress. He was describing the kind of leader companies spent millions trying to find. Not because she managed people, because people naturally followed her example. At that moment, the little girl who had hugged Naomi earlier walked back into the restaurant through the front door, her grandfather now sitting safely in a wheelchair pushed by one of the paramedics. The old man insisted on stopping before leaving. He looked directly at Naomi. "My dear." His voice was still weak. "But my heart has never felt stronger." Naomi stepped closer. "You should rest, sir." He smiled warmly. "I will." Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and carefully removed the folded crayon drawing his granddaughter had made. "I think." He gently placed it back into Naomi's hands. "You'll need this reminder much more than I will." She looked down at the uneven words written in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for smiling." Her eyes glistened, not because of the paper, but because after a night filled with arrogance, fear, and humiliation, the smallest act of kindness somehow carried the greatest weight. And standing only a few feet away, Richard Harrington finally began to understand that some lessons could never be bought. They had to be lived. The restaurant slowly returned to motion, but it no longer sounded the same. The clinking glasses were softer. Conversations carried a new restraint. Even the laughter seemed quieter, as though everyone had been reminded that life could change between one heartbeat and the next. Naomi folded the little girl's crayon drawing with extraordinary care before slipping it into the inside pocket of her sweater. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't elegant. Yet somehow it felt more valuable than anything else she had received in years. She returned to clearing tables, one by one, without ceremony, without expecting anyone to notice. But people did. A young couple stood as she approached. The husband smiled. "Miss." Naomi looked up. "We just wanted to say thank you." She smiled politely. "I'm glad he's all right." "No." The wife gently shook her head. "We mean, thank you for reminding all of us what kindness looks like." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. "That's very kind of you." Another guest nodded in agreement. Then another. No applause. No dramatic speeches. Only quiet gratitude passing naturally from one table to the next. The kind that felt genuine because nobody was trying to impress anyone. Richard watched every exchange from across the dining room. No one approached him. No one congratulated him. No one even seemed to notice the billionaire standing alone beside his untouched dinner. For perhaps the first time in decades, his wealth had become the least interesting thing in the room. His assistant stepped closer again. "Sir, should I have your car brought around?" Richard looked toward the window. Rain had begun falling outside. Tiny droplets streaked across the glass, blurring the lights of Manhattan into soft ribbons of gold and white. "Cancel my next meeting." The assistant blinked. "Sir." "I said cancel it." "The Singapore investors flew. They can fly home." The assistant hesitated. "They've been waiting 3 months." Richard gave a tired smile that surprised even himself. "So has my daughter." The words escaped before he could reconsider them. Silence followed. His assistant simply nodded. "I'll make the calls." As he walked away, Richard remained standing beside the empty chair. His phone felt unusually heavy in his hand. He opened Emily's voicemail. For several seconds he couldn't bring himself to press play. Finally, he did. Her voice filled the silence inside his chest. "Hi, Dad." A pause. I know you're probably busy again. A soft laugh. I just wanted to tell you that today would have been Mom's birthday. Another pause. I went to her favorite bakery. I bought 2 slices of cheesecake. I ate one, and the other one sat across from me. Silence. I guess I just missed you today. The message ended there. Nothing dramatic. No accusations. No anger. Only loneliness. Richard stared at the blank screen long after the recording had finished. He suddenly realized he couldn't remember the last meal he had shared with his own daughter. Not because it had been too long ago, but because there had always been another meeting, another investor, another deadline. Across the restaurant, Naomi quietly helped the dishwasher carry a heavy crate of clean plates back toward the kitchen. Richard found himself wondering what Emily would have thought of her. Probably, she would have liked her. The thought hurt more than he expected. Daniel approached again. Mr. Harrington. Richard looked up slowly. I owe Miss Brooks something. Daniel nodded. I know. Richard reached inside his wallet. He removed several crisp $100 bills and held them for a moment. Then, he quietly slid them back into his pocket. Money suddenly felt strangely inadequate. What time does she finish? Daniel checked his watch. Another hour. Richard nodded thoughtfully. I'll wait. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You don't have to. I know. But I think. He searched for words he wasn't used to saying. Some conversations shouldn't happen while someone's carrying trays. Daniel smiled faintly. She'd appreciate that. Richard walked back to his table. For the first time all evening, he picked up the steak Naomi had served him. It was cold now. The butter had hardened. The vegetables had lost their color. He cut a small piece anyway. Medium rare. Perfect. Exactly as it had been the first time. He chewed slowly. His eyes closed for a brief moment. The problem had never been the food. It had never been the service. The flaw had been sitting in the chair all along. Across the room, Naomi glanced toward table 12. She noticed Richard quietly eating in complete silence. No complaints. No demands. No raised voice. Just one man alone with his thoughts. She didn't know what had changed inside him. She only knew that the hardest hearts rarely cracked all at once. Sometimes they began with a single quiet moment, when a person finally stopped judging the one standing before them and started confronting the one staring back from the mirror. Richard finished the last bite of the now cold steak and slowly placed the knife beside his plate. For the first time in years, the taste of the food barely registered. His thoughts had wandered somewhere entirely different. He looked across the dining room and found Naomi wiping down an empty table with the same quiet care she had shown every customer throughout the evening. She moved as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though saving a man's life had simply been another responsibility that came with serving dinner. The realization unsettled him. Most people he knew would have accepted praise, sought recognition, or found a way to turn such a moment into an opportunity. Naomi had done none of those things. She simply returned to work. Richard stood from his chair and buttoned his jacket. His assistants immediately stepped toward him, expecting another instruction. Instead, he looked at them with an unfamiliar calm. Go ahead without me. Both assistants exchanged confused glances. Sir, are you certain? Yes. What should we tell the investors? Richard slipped his phone into his pocket. Tell them something more important came up. They had never heard him say those words before. After a brief hesitation, they quietly left the restaurant, leaving Richard standing alone for the first time that evening. Daniel noticed and approached carefully. Mr. Harrington, can I get you anything? Richard shook his head. Only the truth. Daniel smiled faintly. About what? Richard looked toward Naomi once more. About her. Daniel folded his hands behind his back before answering. She has worked here for nearly 4 years. She has never been late. She has never raised her voice at a guest. Half of our regular customers ask to sit in her section. The other half eventually become her regular customers. Richard listened without interrupting. Daniel continued. When one of our cooks lost his wife last winter, Naomi organized meal deliveries for his children. Nobody asked her to. She simply did it. When one of the dishwashers could not afford community college tuition, she quietly covered the first semester. We only found out because the school accidentally mailed the receipt here instead of to her apartment. Richard looked surprised. She paid for someone else's education while working here? Daniel nodded. She said education lasts longer than money. Richard remained silent. Most people never hear those stories because she never tells them. Daniel glanced toward Naomi, who was helping an elderly couple into their coats near the entrance. She believes kindness loses something the moment it becomes a performance. Those words settled heavily inside Richard's mind. He thought about the awards covering the walls of his corporate headquarters, photographs of charity galas, oversized donation checks, magazine interviews praising his philanthropy. Suddenly they felt strangely incomplete. He had spent years making generosity visible. Naomi had spent years making it invisible. A few moments later, the elderly gentleman whose life had been saved was preparing to leave with his granddaughter. Before reaching the door, he slowly turned his wheelchair toward Richard. Their eyes met. The old man offered a warm smile. "Young man." Richard stepped closer. "Yes, sir. You built a remarkable business, I imagine." Richard nodded politely. "I have been fortunate." The old man looked toward Naomi before returning his gaze to Richard. "Tonight I met someone who built something even harder." Richard frowned gently. "What is that?" The old man squeezed his granddaughter's hand and smiled. "A life that makes strangers feel safe." Without another word, he allowed the paramedic to wheel him toward the waiting ambulance transport van. Richard remained standing near the entrance long after they disappeared into the rainy Manhattan night. He had spent decades measuring success in numbers, contracts, buildings, and headlines. Yet one quiet sentence from a man whose life had almost ended had somehow made every one of those measurements seem painfully small. The clock above the service station quietly slipped past 9:30 as the last wave of dinner guests began leaving Hawthorne and Ash. Rain continued tapping gently against the tall windows, washing the city lights into long ribbons of gold across the wet pavement outside. Naomi collected the final stack of menus from the hostess stand before returning them to their shelf. It had been one of the longest shifts she could remember, yet she moved with the same quiet rhythm that had carried her through every challenge since the restaurant opened that morning. Richard Harrington remained seated near the window. His table had long been cleared, his assistants had already left, and fresh guests had come and gone around him. Still he had not walked out the door. Daniel noticed Naomi hanging her apron on the hook beside the employee entrance. "You are finally finished." She smiled tiredly. "Almost. Someone has been waiting for you." Naomi followed his eyes toward the dining room. Richard stood as soon as he saw her approaching. For the first time that evening, there was no command in his posture, no expectation that the room should revolve around him. He simply waited. Naomi stopped a respectful distance away. "Good evening again, sir." Richard looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Would you sit with me for just a minute?" Naomi glanced toward Daniel, who quietly nodded before disappearing into the kitchen to give them privacy. She pulled out the chair across from Richard and sat down with both hands folded gently in her lap. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence felt different now. It was no longer uncomfortable. It simply gave both of them space to think. Richard finally broke it. "I owe you an apology." Naomi listened without interrupting. "Everything I said tonight was wrong." He lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I confused wealth with worth. I believed my position gave me permission to speak to you in ways I would never want someone speaking to my own family." Naomi remained quiet. Richard continued, his voice noticeably softer than it had been. "Hours earlier, when I asked you to polish my shoes." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence immediately. "I have replayed that moment in my mind again and again." He let out a slow breath. "I cannot change the fact that I said it." Naomi answered gently, "No, sir. But I wish I could." Another brief silence settled between them. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a business card. He placed it on the table without sliding it toward her. "I own several hospitals and rehabilitation centers through one of my foundations." Naomi looked at the card but made no move to pick it up. After hearing about your nursing background, Richard continued, I would like to offer you any position you want. Emergency care, administration, training, whatever allows you to return to the career you clearly belong in. Naomi looked at him with genuine appreciation. That is a generous offer. Richard nodded. It is the least I can do. Naomi smiled warmly before gently pushing the card back across the table. Richard looked surprised. You are saying no? Not because I am ungrateful. She chose her words carefully. My mother still needs me every morning before sunrise and every evening after work. Right now, this schedule allows me to be where she needs me most. Richard slowly nodded as understanding settled across his face. You are choosing her again. Every day. A faint smile appeared on Richard's face. I spent years believing success meant never saying no to another opportunity. Naomi's eyes reflected quiet compassion. Sometimes the greatest opportunity is being present for the people who cannot ask us to stay forever. Richard looked down at his hands. Those words reached deeper than any criticism ever could. He thought of Emily eating cheesecake alone. He thought of postponed birthdays, missed phone calls, and conversations that had always been delayed until next week. He finally looked back up at Naomi and realized something extraordinary. She had never tried to make him feel guilty. She had simply shown him another way to live. Naomi stood and slipped her sweater over her shoulder before picking up her small canvas bag. The restaurant had grown almost silent. Chairs were being turned upside down onto empty tables. The piano had long since stopped playing, leaving only the quiet hum of refrigerators and the gentle rhythm of rain outside. Richard rose as well. For a brief moment, neither of them moved toward the door. It felt as though the evening deserved one last conversation. May I ask you one more question? Richard said. Naomi smiled politely. Of course. He hesitated, choosing his words with far greater care than he had shown only a few hours earlier. After everything I said to you tonight, after the way I treated you, why did you still help that gentleman without thinking twice? Naomi looked toward the rain-covered windows before answering. Because he was not the person hurting me. Richard remained silent. He was someone who needed help. She continued softly. Pain should never decide who deserves kindness. Those words settled between them like the quiet snowfall of winter, gentle yet impossible to ignore. Richard lowered his head for a moment. I am not sure I would have done the same. Naomi looked at him with calm understanding. Maybe not yesterday. She smiled gently. But perhaps tomorrow. Richard found himself smiling for the first time that evening. It was small, honest, entirely different from the confident expressions that usually appeared in business magazines. Together they walked toward the front entrance. Daniel was locking the wine cabinet while Elena waved goodbye from the kitchen doorway. Good night, Naomi. See you tomorrow. She pushed open the heavy front door. Cool evening air drifted inside, carrying the clean scent of rain and fresh pavement. The city seemed quieter than usual. Richard stepped outside beside her. Black sedans lined the curb, one of them waiting patiently for him with its headlights glowing against the wet street. His driver immediately stepped forward and opened the rear door. Richard thanked him before turning back toward Naomi instead of getting inside. I have spent my entire career teaching people how to build successful companies. Naomi listened quietly. Tonight you reminded me that building a successful life is something completely different. Naomi gave a modest smile. Most people already know what matters. Richard looked puzzled. Then why do so many of us forget? She glanced toward the warm lights still glowing behind the restaurant windows. Because success speaks very loudly. Her eyes returned to his. But character usually whispers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Traffic rolled steadily through the intersection. Somewhere in the distance, a subway train rumbled beneath the streets of Manhattan. Richard reached into his pocket once more. But this time he did not remove a business card or his wallet. Instead, he pulled out his phone. He searched for one familiar name. Emily. Without allowing himself another excuse, he pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a sleepy voice answered. Dad. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Hi, sweetheart. Silence filled the line for just a second. Is everything okay? She asked. Richard smiled as rain collected on the shoulders of his coat. I was actually calling to ask if you would have dinner with me tomorrow. Another pause followed. Then he heard something he had not realized he missed so deeply. His daughter laughed. It was warm, surprised, and genuine. I would like that. Richard thanked her quietly before ending the call. When he looked up again, Naomi had already started walking toward the subway entrance several blocks away. She never looked back to see whether he was watching. She did not need to. She had never been trying to change his opinion. She had simply refused to let his opinion change who she was. Richard stood on the sidewalk until her figure disappeared into the evening crowd. Only then did he understand that the greatest lesson of the night had not come from the emergency, the apology, or even their conversation. It came from a woman who had quietly proven that true dignity never asks permission to exist. 6 months passed almost unnoticed. Spring slowly replaced the gray chill of winter, and Manhattan once again filled with open cafe doors, flowering trees, and sidewalks crowded with people chasing another busy day. Inside Hawthorne and Ash very little had changed, at least on the surface. The chandeliers still reflected across polished glasses. The steak still arrived perfectly prepared. The piano still played softly during dinner service. Naomi Brooks still greeted every guest with the same quiet smile that had never depended on how they treated her. Some evenings were busy. Some were slow. She continued balancing trays, remembering regular customers by name, and rushing home each night to care for her mother before sunrise arrived once again. She never spoke about the evening that had changed so many lives because to her, kindness was not a story to repeat. It was simply a habit worth protecting. One Friday evening, Daniel walked quickly across the dining room carrying a newspaper folded beneath his arm. He stopped beside Naomi with an amused smile. You might want to see this. She looked at the front page. The headline was not about business profits or another corporate acquisition. It read, Harrington Foundation launches Respect First initiative across hospitals and restaurants. Beneath the headline was a photograph of Richard Harrington speaking to hundreds of managers gathered inside a conference hall. Naomi quietly read a short quote printed below the picture. Every person deserves dignity before they deserve service. She smiled softly before handing the newspaper back. That is wonderful. Daniel looked at her knowingly. I think you know where that came from. Naomi simply returned to wiping down the table beside her. Later that evening, the restaurant doors opened once again. Richard Harrington stepped inside alone. No assistants followed him. No security surrounded him. He wore a simple charcoal jacket without the expensive confidence that had once entered the room before he did. Several employees recognized him immediately, but something else caught their attention first. Before the hostess could greet him, Richard smiled warmly and said, Good evening. I have a reservation under Harrington. Thank you for having me. The hostess blinked in surprise before returning the smile. Right this way, sir. As he passed through the dining room, he nodded politely to every employee he met. When Naomi approached his table carrying a menu, their eyes met once again. Good evening, Mr. Harrington. Richard stood before she reached the table. Good evening, Naomi. There was genuine warmth in his voice now. It is good to see you again. Likewise. She handed him the menu. May I recommend the chef's special? Richard smiled. I trust your recommendation completely. When she returned a few minutes later with sparkling water, Richard accepted the glass with both hands. Thank you. 2 words. Simple words. Yet everyone who had witnessed the first evening understood how much they meant. Before Naomi walked away, Richard quietly placed something on the table beside her order pad. It was not money. It was the old crayon drawing, now carefully preserved inside a clear protective sleeve. Across the top, the child's uneven handwriting still read, Thank you for smiling. Richard looked at the drawing before speaking. I asked the little girl if I could borrow it for a while. Naomi looked surprised. She said yes. He nodded. She told me smiles are meant to be shared. Naomi laughed softly. She sounds very wise. Richard smiled. She learned from the right person. Naomi carefully picked up the drawing, holding it as though it were made of glass. Neither of them spoke again for a moment. They did not need to. Outside, evening sunlight reflected across the restaurant windows, filling the room with a gentle golden glow. Richard had entered that restaurant believing respect could be purchased. He left understanding it had to be earned. Naomi never became richer. She never became famous. She simply remained the woman she had always been. And in doing so, she reminded one man, and everyone fortunate enough to witness that evening, that kindness is never a sign of weakness. Sometimes it is the quietest voice in the room that changes a heart forever.